I'm Summer Lacey, and welcome to The Briefing, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. We're joined today by Michigan Representative Rashida Tlaib and by Rihanna Eckel, Maryland organizer for Food and Water Watch. Now, amidst the worst economic crisis in a century, families are struggling to pay for basic necessities like housing, healthcare, food, and utilities, including electricity, gas, and water. Water shutoffs are happening across the country. According to the National Resource Defense Council, only 16 states adopted bans on water shutoffs during the pandemic. 8 of those bans have already expired, and 2 more are expiring September 1st. Many local jurisdictions also put in place shutoff bans, but many of those have also expired. Millions of people in America, disproportionately from communities of color, are experiencing water access insecurity. People are using the same water to cook, clean, and to flush toilets. In the context of the pandemic, with CDC guidelines calling for regular hand washing and cleaning to maintain sanitary conditions, water shutoffs are especially dangerous. Lack of clean water access has accelerated the spread of COVID-19 worldwide, including in the United States. For example, the long history of denying the Navajo Nation's legal right to water access has resulted in some of the highest infection rates in the country. Black and Brown communities have been hit hardest by the pandemic and are historically disproportionately impacted by water shutoffs. Activists have called to ban water shutoffs for years, describing it as a form of systemic environmental injustice. They face opposition from water companies who suggest that suspending water shutoffs will only increase costs later on, and from officials who have even gone as far as to erroneously claim that there is no evidence linking health risks to water interruptions, which is contrary to what experts unanimously say. More than 115 bans on water shutoffs have expired, and nearly 70 million people in America risk losing guaranteed water access by September 1st, as more bans end, including in Maryland and Wisconsin. Representative Rashida Tlaib has introduced legislation with 68 co-sponsors that would provide water to at-need families and prohibit water shutoffs nationally, with the next pandemic relief package now under discussion. So let's get started with our conversation. And turning first to Representative Tlaib. Now, Representative, you were on our program in May, and you were talking about water security and your bill to suspend water shutoffs during the pandemic. The bill would also provide an initial $1.5 billion to ensure that people with low incomes do not lose access to critical water supplies during the pandemic, including tribal territories. Can you tell our viewers what has happened since then in the battle to include federal water accessibility in pandemic relief legislation?
No, thank you, Summer. I think folks, since May, we call it the Emergency Water is a Human Right Fund, which I introduced with one of my colleagues, Representative Debbie Dingell, is now actually being championed and is in the HEROES Act that we passed. And it's being championed by leaders like Senators Markey, Warren, Harris in the Senate. Specifically, the bill, just for folks to know, the act actually prohibits any shutoff, but it requires actual connection. So even if folks were completely shut off before, they're now being required to reconnect them to water. It ensures robust water affordability protections for households with incomes up to 150% of the federal poverty guidelines. The $1.5 billion grant will assist low-income households to pay high proportion of household income for drinking water and wastewater services. We saw, I think, a close to 30% increase in the cost of water across the nation. Because of the work of Food and Water Watch, and advocates across the country, we have elevated this issue so that Speaker Pelosi now and Leader Schumer have also spoken up in support of Water as a Human Right Fund, which is incredibly like a huge accomplishment because of the advocates. I want folks to understand what doing nothing looks like when it comes to access to water. Like Summer talked about, right? I mean, public health experts have warned us that appropriate pandemic response, it's measured, including like access to water to wash your hands with soap and water, and the lack of water in a run of like of hand sanitizer and other cleaning products means areas without water are particularly vulnerable for COVID right now. But millions, I know, close to 14 million Americans, fellow neighbors across the country are experiencing some sort of, shut off or a warning of a shut off because of this. Now, one of the things that the study showed, that Michigan state study funded by the National Science Foundation found that about 14 million families might find their water bill unaffordable. But the EPA recommends that families spend no more than 4.5% of their income on water. With tens of millions of Americans unemployed right now during the pandemic, millions are at risk of losing access to water. So it's really critically important. And, Summer, you talked about this, but, how people need water. I mean, water is life. I mean, you talk about, this huge increase of funding for food, but I don't think people realize just how much, even in the private sector, have been able to drain some of our public resources, including access to water. And, I know Rihanna and others and advocates have been talking about this. There has been a serious move to try to privatize our water. I watched Nestle company take water for less than $300 and turn around and say, oh, look, we're helping Flint, who has lead poisoned water. We're giving them about 18,000 bottled water. I mean, it's just the absurdity of the fact that this is a public resource, right? That we are denying access to this, especially during a pandemic. So we have to continue to fight back. And right now, many of my colleagues, because it's in the HEROES Act or now it's in the Senate, many are speaking up and saying, look, we need to make sure, just like we make sure that people have heat during the winter, just making sure that folks have access to food during really a huge economic crisis, we have to be able to say, look, we have to make sure water is accessible to everyone.
Now, Representative Tlaib, going off of your point that water is life, in our last discussion, we talked about how early on in the pandemic, water access issues hurt people across the country and took lives away, basically, including Larry Welch, a disabled Army veteran, and his mother, Marianne, both of whom died from COVID-19 in March, after Larry had to regularly drive 90 minutes from a public water tap to his mother's home in Navajo Mountain, Arizona. Now, what has been done over the course of the summer, so since our last conversation in May, to ensure that we don't see more situations like that, and what still needs to be done?
I mean, we need to pass the HEROES Act that has the Water as a Human Right Fund. That's what we need to do. I mean, McConnell is right now went on vacation. He literally left. He left our country, our neighbors, our children, our families. I mean, school districts don't even know what's going on in regards to this pandemic. He just left. And right now we have, millions of Americans, and even in my district, I know thousands still don't have access to water. And you have what you have right now is happening, as you talked about it. I call it gaslighting and really borderline lying to the American public, denying the science, denying that you need access to water during a pandemic. The fact that they don't see it as a public health crisis. I mean, before this pandemic, it was a public health crisis, and we were talking about it in Detroit and throughout Wayne County communities in Michigan. And one of the things that, is really frustrating is I hear from so many of my colleagues, including Democratic colleagues, say to me, well, the Water Authority doesn't think this is the right approach. They don't think, well, I said, the current approach isn't working. It's not, it's denying access. So unless we first focus on the fact that water needs to be accessible to everyone, it needs to be a right, then we can work around the solution. But a lot of folks are making this out like this is not a huge issue, but one death is far enough. I mean, to me, that's enough. But when I see, especially during this uprising in our country right now, where people are so, screaming in the streets about Black Lives Matter, when I see 40% of African Americans in Michigan dying of COVID, where African Americans only make less than 15% of the total population. Just look at this specific thing. If you look at who's getting denied access to water affordable access to water, it's indigenous communities, it's Black and brown communities, it's poor communities, it's in rural areas too, where literally they're being left behind when it comes to water and utility access. So I say, make McConnell and many of the Senate folks do something about the fact that many are right now during this global pandemic do not have access to water to protect themselves, so that we can save lives.
And Representative, going off your last point, I mean, many of our viewers might think of water problems in this country as being something that is happening in Flint, Michigan, something that maybe we have a handle on right now, but they don't understand that we're talking about an issue that affects millions of people in many of our states. And really, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar level need for water access. And your bill represents a major start on that. What are the costs associated with water shortages? And just to further touch upon this, on the flip side, what are the costs of inaction?
I mean, it's going to cost people, their lives. And I don't think people realize before the pandemic, before COVID came, there was a huge hepatitis spread in part of the city of Detroit, where you saw the correlation that they had higher rates of water shut off. And then the spread of hepatitis was increasing, right? So we kept showing the Detroit Water Authority, city leadership here in Detroit, there is a public health crisis right now. There's also a human crisis in that many of my neighbors that were getting their water shut off, especially mothers with children, the next day Child Protective Services showed up and took their children away from them, Summer, because it was considered negligent because they couldn't afford water. And I just don't think people understand, because it's not happening to them right away. But also, there is this shame that happens. There's so many of my neighbors will not tell people they don't have water. I know this woman in Tennessee, I mean, she was breaking in tears. We had her on the show before, and she was she was in tears talking about how she has to go to her son's house to take a shower, to wash her clothes, and how she just tries her best not to have to do that and be a burden. And you hear her, and she wants to pay. She just cannot pay the higher costs, right? She's like, anything, just work with me. Give me an affordability plan that is based on my income. So a lot of my neighbors are just not being treated. I mean, I look at Coca-Cola and Pepsi. I mean, this is real. I have golf courses that have past due water bills, and they're not getting their water shut off, watering the grass at the golf course. Or Coca-Cola, who's using, Pepsi, they're literally using gallons and gallons of fresh water to produce their products that are for profit. And my folks get their water shut off for $150. I mean, that's just the you can see how unbelievably unjust it is, unfair, and just inhumane it is right now. But this is a freaking pandemic. Like, wake up. Folks need water. And if they don't think it's going to touch them, they're absolutely in denial. Because if folks don't have water, it impacts that community, that neighborhood, and other people's lives are put at risk because of it.
Thank you, Representative. And really creating the picture that watering grass is being prioritized over putting water on people's tables, putting water in babies' bottles. I mean, that really is so important. And thank you for making that clear for us. And turning now to Rihanna, thank you for being here with us from Baltimore. And Maryland Governor Larry Hogan's executive order and extension banning utility shutoffs is expiring. What is at stake for communities in Maryland?
So much is at stake. The impacts of shutoffs, as Representative Tlaib has said, and as you have said, Summer, are just absolutely devastating for communities. As people are losing jobs and wages in really just unprecedented numbers, they're struggling to file for unemployment and generally just navigating our scary new reality. I mean, as you have said, imagine trying to stay safely at home without being able to wash your hands, without being able to bathe. Without being able to flush your toilet and do all of these things that so many of us take for granted. And in Maryland, luckily Governor Hogan, every time the utility moratorium has been about to expire, he has extended it the day before. And so we're hoping again for that to be renewed. But of course, we won't see until a few days from now. So we're hoping that he will, again, step up and put that moratorium and renew that. But, you know, we've heard from people across the country who have been shut off during this pandemic, and their stories are just absolutely heart-wrenching. And that's really what's at stake for Maryland's families and for every family that lives in a community that has a utility shut-off moratorium that is expiring. One example is we heard from a man in Ohio who reached out after he had his water shut off for just $200 in outstanding bills. He lives with his partner and their 6 children under the age of 10. He had lost his job at the start of this pandemic. His unemployment checks were incredibly delayed. He only got the first one this month. He knew that Ohio had a moratorium in place, and so he thought he was safe. But he actually hadn't realized that Ohio's moratorium had expired just a few days earlier. So his water was shut off, and luckily enough, his family was able to go to members of their extended family and get the money in order to restore the service to their home. But not everyone is that lucky, and many people are facing bills that are above what their family members or friends could be able to pitch in and help them pay off. And that's a very real threat for hundreds of thousands of people across the country. Some statistics we heard the Georgia Municipal Association shared this week that in some cities in Georgia, a third of customers are on a utility disconnection list. It was also reported earlier this week that Memphis Gas, Light, and Water has over 15,000 customers on their shutoff list. More than 1 million homes in North Carolina were facing utility shutoffs when their state moratorium expired last month. And before Wisconsin extended their shutoff moratorium, they noted that a third of households were behind on their utility bills. And this rings true across the country. No matter what where you are in the country, this is a problem. And it's crucial to note that, as you said, Summer, and as you have said, Congresswoman, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by the lack of access to safe water. Despite being served shutoff notices at roughly the same rate as white families, Black families are more than twice as likely to be shut off. We know that the coronavirus, of course, as you said, overburdens communities of color as well. But really, how are these people meant to keep themselves and their communities safe when they can't wash their hands, when they can't take basic hygiene steps? So this makes it even more crucial for Congress to pass and for the Senate to pass the HEROES Act and the Emergency Water is a Human Right Act. So this is a matter of human rights and racial justice.
Thank you, Rihanna. How are state legislators, in Maryland responding to this? I mean, you stated that you all are hopeful that Governor Hogan will extend the ban on shutoffs, and maybe it might be, the day before it's set to expire. You're hopeful that that will happen again. But is there opposition to extending it? And if so, what is that opposition and why do you think it's there?
Right. So the main opposition that we have seen is from water utility companies. And that's true for local moratorias, for state moratorias, and for even the federal government passing the Water is a Human Right Act. But the root of this is actually that we have had a massive federal disinvestment from our water infrastructure that has created a system where we have unaffordable bills for so many families. People are facing shutoffs because they can't afford their water bills. We have aging infrastructure across the country. Some of it is hundreds of years old. Federal funding for water infrastructure has absolutely plummeted since the 1970s. The federal government used to give around $77 per person for water infrastructure, and now it's only around $14 per person per year that goes to municipal governments to fund their water infrastructure upgrades. So municipalities have had to raise rates on customers year after year in order to collect enough to do those infrastructure upgrades, or they are lured in by private water companies, as the Congresswoman has said, and then those companies leave those systems and communities in worse conditions than when they arrived. But exactly, when people cannot pay their bills, they're shut off. State legislators in Maryland, of course, many are advocating for this utility shutoff moratorium to be extended. It is also coinciding with, we had a eviction moratorium in Maryland that is officially ending on September 1st as well. And in many places across the country, or in many places across the state, people can be evicted for unaffordable water bills as well. It can be included as a condition of rent. So people are facing shutoffs, and they're even facing losing their place to live in their homes due to unaffordable water bills. And so we're hoping, that Hogan will do the right thing, but ultimately, it will be up to him, but we'll get something done.
Oh, thank you, Rihanna, and we will all be watching to see what happens. Now, I'd like to pose my next questions to both of you. Now, a report from the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress shows that nearly 9 out of 10 voters support a ban on utility shutoffs and prohibition on late fees. And a new report out today shows that 3/4 of the public want state and federal funding for clean water to go to cities and budget shortfalls. Now, what ways has the public conversation on water rights evolved in the course of the pandemic? And Representative Tlaib, can you please start us off on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of folks are realizing these moratoriums are exactly very supportive, I think, among a lot of advocates and residents and my neighbors, but they are Band-Aids. I mean, these are not permanent fixes to the major issues that, honestly, if it's not just the water infrastructure issue, access to water, clean water, all of those things, those existed prior to the pandemic, is just now showing its really true ugly face in light of this and creating this public health crisis that we see. So I think much of what you're hearing from folks and seeing that it's polling well is that it's similar to what you see when it comes to recurring payments, to trying to invest in communities, is that people want to be put first. Put us first. Prioritize our health, prioritize our quality of life, put some of these issues, including our where we live, protecting us from foreclosures, protecting us from evictions, protecting us from water shutoffs and utility shutoffs. I think it's very common. I don't care if you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, or Libertarian. If you talk to anybody, they're all going to say, no, government should be about people. Government needs to be working for us. Absolutely. And that absolutely involves like our public resources, which is our water. That belongs to us, the people. And instead of it going through these, what I call quasi-governmental authorities and these processes that are making it unaffordable, doesn't work for us. I mean, you should know, Summer, I worked so hard to just get the $22.5 billion alone just for the lead, that replace the lead contaminated pipelines, because in the past they were doing partial replacement as if any amount of lead is safe. And so there's this push of, from folks to put these, what I call Band-Aids approach. And I think a lot of residents and neighbors and people that you're talking to and the polling coming back is saying, yeah, we need that, but we need more. We need us to be prioritized as first when it comes to a lot of this aid and relief packages that are coming through Congress right now.
Thank you, Representative. And Rihanna, what are your thoughts on this? How have you seen the public conversation about water rights evolve over the course of this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think no one can deny that everyone should have access to water in their home during this pandemic, when we're all meant to be staying at home in order to keep ourselves and our communities safe. I think, for folks who support this, what's really important is that they raise their voice about this issue, because as Congresswoman Tlaib said, we have solutions, but we need our representatives to stand up and push for those bold solutions that are going to change things. So we have the Water Act that was introduced by Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence and Senator Bernie Sanders, that would put a ton of money into our water infrastructure and make sure that we can actually do those infrastructure upgrades that we need. And we have the Emergency Water is a Human Right Act that can, in the short term, guarantee that folks have access to water right now, which is so important. And what people, I think, for all those percentage of folks that support this, should absolutely be reaching out to their elected officials. So if you're watching with us, you should definitely call 202-609-9041 and let your senators know that they need to get back to work and pass the HEROES Act, pass a bill that includes a shutoff moratorium and look towards more in-depth and sustainable water funding for our system, so that we don't face problems like this again in the future.
Thank you, Rihanna. Now, Representative Tlaib, at the top of the show, we talked about how limited water access has been affecting the Navajo Nation really historically in this country. Can you tell us more about how this summer has impacted water access for Indigenous American communities?
Yeah, I talked to Congresswoman Deb Haaland about this, and as I've been fighting for water as a human right fund, she expressed that this was again, this was very much a crisis prior to the pandemic, but it's gotten worse because of it. So water access, it's not even just water access, it's clean water access. And that has been a huge dilemma. And again, it's because of lack of investment in our Indigenous communities, the fact that they keep, in many ways, during policies, and I see it in other kind of communities of color, not have any access to the funding opportunities. I mean, I don't know how many times Congresswoman Deb Haaland will say, does that include Indigenous communities? Does it include tribal land? Does it include everyone that is in the United States, right? And so I know that when it comes to this crisis, again, the access to water, it's shown its face because now more than ever, public health experts, others are now realizing even more now because they're being asked to go wash their hands, to make sure to be careful, to have that access, to make sure they're doing that to stop the spread of COVID. They're realizing so many of the folks they're encountering, the public health folks, the advocates, do not have access to water and clean water. And so I know that it's something that is a bit of an urgency for Congresswoman Haaland and others that have a huge Indigenous population. And I know she, right away, she said to me, this is what my community needs. And I said, millions across the nation, not just in my city in Detroit or in the Wayne County communities here, but it's a crisis nationally.
Thank you, Representative Rihanna. Do you have thoughts to add on that question?
I would just add that we saw a report that even before the pandemic started, 15% of Native Americans didn't have access to water. And those numbers are hard to come upon, but it could be even as much as 40%, 40 to 50% of Native Americans lacking access to water. And that, by comparison, only 0.6% of non-Native communities completely lack access to water. So we're looking at such a staggering injustice, and it's crucial that Native communities not be left out of this conversation, and that we continue to push forward and get them water.
And Rihanna, those numbers are astounding, and they cannot be ignored. And they lead me to my next question, which is the Postal Service Postmaster General has been under scrutiny the past few weeks for his role in a mail delivery crisis, with services as basic as mail delivery and waste collection falling by the wayside during the pandemic. And water has not received the same kind of magnified attention. And based on our conversation, it seems like something that we should be talking about every single day. So what do you think of this? And Representative Tlaib, can you start us off on your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's an urgency to the United States Postal Service because of the outcry across the country. It's one of the things that touches every single person in our nation. And it handles, I think, 50% of the world's mail, not just the mail in the United States is handled by the United States Postal Service. So of course, folks are being directly impacted in every single district. So there was this outcry immediately. I think, when it comes to this kind of outcry, when it comes to access to water, again, a lot of our residents and neighbors are not, one, they're already dealing with so much trauma, not having access to water. They're not out there organizing protests or trying to get congressional hearings. I mean, we're the advocates. We're the ones that they're coming to and others on their behalf. I have so many that won't even, we had a public hearing just on environmental injustices here in Detroit in my district. And, people didn't want to talk about not living without water. They were really ashamed. It was something that, again, it was trauma. It's also something that people don't easily want to share and talk about. And so I think, this is a human rights campaign, right? This is about, going out there and trying to humanize and understanding what the impact is. But I think Rihanna and many of the other advocates out there they have enough data and the science is out there that water needs to be part of the response to the pandemic. And so we just have to continue talking about it as a public health issue. I mean, look, we stopped even talking about testing and tracking during the U.S. Postal Service. I mean, this is, why? Because it impacts elections. It's impact, there's all these dynamics that are involved. And for my residents, they were calling me not about their ballots as much as they were calling me about their medication that they depend on getting through the mail. And so it is this continued disconnect that we're going to get, that we have right now in Congress. So many people don't have the similar lived experiences, or are not that rooted or connected to the ground of what's actually happening during this pandemic, where a lot of advocates and people that have engaged, movement folks that have continued to engage me on this, show me otherwise, that this is one of the biggest crises that we have in our district is access to water.
Thank you, Representative. Rihanna, what are your thoughts on the lack of attention paid to limited access to water?
Yeah, I mean, of course, both of these issues are very important, and they're in fact interconnected because water shutoff notices are frequently delivered by the mail. So if folks are having their mail delayed, then they could potentially miss that water shutoff notice and have their water shut off before they're even aware. But I think the reason, that the attention is so much on the Postal Service right now is that the Trump administration is systematically undercutting the Postal Service right now. Our water infrastructure was systematically undercut and defunded years ago, back in the 70s under the Reagan administration. It has continued to be defunded over time. So we are seeing the impacts of that systematic destruction of our water system and of the funding now, but it happened already. So I think that, folks are not reacting with the same outrage because the systematic undercutting has already happened for our water system. But what I would say is that for folks who do care about water access and who do care about the Postal Service, like I said, they're both connected. And again, I would just urge folks to call 202-609-9041 and demand that our senators get back to work, pass the HEROES Act, pass the Emergency Water is a Human Right Act, and make sure that we all have access to water because we need our mail and our water.
Thank you, Rihanna. And just in closing, we are in a time of really national turmoil. We're dealing with the pandemic. We are trying to support family members. We are trying to stay healthy, and many of us dealing with death of loved ones as well, all in the midst of racial injustice. And this week started off with Jacob Blake, being shot 7 times in the back by police officers in Wisconsin. And then later this week, 2 protesters being killed. So it's a difficult time. And in the midst of this, people don't have water. So I'd love to ask you both, what is inspiring you right now to keep going? And what inspiration can you share with our viewers to just keep moving forward? And Rihanna, can you start us off?
Absolutely. What is keeping me inspired is the courage and the strength and the tenacity of our leaders like Congresswoman Tlaib. I am so inspired by all of these representatives who are standing up for our right to water. So we're so grateful for Congresswoman Tlaib, for Representative Dingell, Senator Merkley, who has introduced the Water is a Human Right Act in the Senate. We couldn't do this work without those folks who are able to take their platform and use it to fight for these basic necessities. And I'm really inspired also by the fact that this has become a priority, as Congresswoman said, for both Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader Schumer, who even co-sponsored the Senate version of the Water is a Human Right Act. So really seeing this issue take traction with our party is really inspiring me to keep fighting, and gives me a path to victory, gives us a path to victory.
Thank you, Rihanna. Representative Tlaib, can you give us really your closing thoughts on that matter?
Yeah, this, I was saying earlier to both of you how much I was struggling this week, because you do feel, this constant helplessness as you see so much pain out there and continue with the struggle. But, sometimes in this moment of darkness, there's always this moment of light. So when I talked to Cori Bush a couple weeks ago, the conversation we had, it was this connection that instantly happened that is like, we understand the urgency. Like, I finally have yet another sister in service that understands we don't have another hour, another day. We don't have time to wait anymore. We're tired of people telling us to wait. And so that gives me a tremendous amount of hope. And a friend of mine told me there was this quote or something about, when you throw that rock, there's that ripple effect. So we're throwing those rocks to get that ripple effect that finally will get us where we need to be. And it's been so just I've been so taken aback by what I've seen in Detroit, alone with the uprising and the advocacy. I mean, they've been out there over 100 days, and they haven't stopped, because they're not focused on just what killed George Floyd or Jacob, which, yes, police brutality address it, but they're focusing on not the who, but the what. The who is police brutality, all that culture, but it's really the broader picture of what. It's poverty, it's disinvestment in community, it's anti-Blackness within our policies, into our school system, everything. And so that has been so much light during this really dark time.
Thank you, Representative Tlaib, for those closing words. And thank you to both of our panelists. Thank you, for Rihanna, for being with us here today. This has been such an important and urgent conversation. And I just thank you both for shining a brighter light on this matter, and for everything that you're doing to help our country. This has been The Briefing. Thank you for joining us. We'll be live again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern with a House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Forum featuring Representative Joaquin Castro. We hope to see you all there. Have a wonderful